All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we are cracking open the Entrepreneur's Playbook. We've gone through some of the absolute best, most powerful ideas from Harvard Business Review's collection on entrepreneurship. To really build a guide, a playbook for building a business from the ground up. So let's just get right into it. We all have this picture in our heads, right? The heroic founder, the next big thing. But what does it really take to build a company from nothing? I'll tell you, it's so much more than just a light bulb moment or being a charismatic person. We're going to peel back all the myths and get to the real heart of it. And our journey, well, it's got to start with the spark itself, the entrepreneurial mindset. See, before we can even talk about a business, we have to understand the person behind the wheel. What actually makes an entrepreneur tick? Okay, let's just bust some myths right off the bat. We love to think of entrepreneurs as these risk-seeking daredevils or these power-hungry creative geniuses. But the research, like from Timothy Butler at Harvard Business School, it paints a much more interesting picture. The truth is, it's not really about seeking risk. It's about being comfortable with uncertainty. It's not about being a lone genius so much as it's about being deeply, restlessly curious. And that idea of being power-hungry? Turns out it's actually something else entirely. A genuine, burning passion for ownership. Timothy Butler just nails this idea of ownership. He says, it's not about having supremacy. It's about having control over the finished product. Just think about that for a second. He's saying that entrepreneurs have more in common with an author or an artist than a dictator. It's about that need to create something, to shape it, to bring an idea into the world and be able to say, I made this. That's the artisan's impulse, not the tyrant's. So, you've got the mindset. What comes next? The blueprint. And this is where your big idea slams into reality, and it brings up a huge question for our modern world. Do you stick to a super detailed plan, or do you stay ready to pivot at a moment's notice? For years and years, the old school advice was always this. Before you do a single thing, you write a massive, detailed 5-year business plan. I mean, we're talking a huge document, just filled with charts and projections that stretch out for years. That was considered step 1, no questions asked. But here's the problem with that. William Salmon, a professor at Harvard Business School, he just cuts right through the noise. He says financial projections for a new company are an act of imagination. And he's right. When you're starting something new, there are so many unknowns that these big, detailed plans often just become exercises in creative writing. And so, the whole way of thinking has changed. We've shifted from that traditional, rigid plan to something way more agile, the lean startup, which was championed by people like Steve Blank. So instead of all this elaborate planning done in secret, it's all about experimentation and getting customer feedback. You're not just executing a model you think is perfect, you're actively searching for a model that actually works in the real world. A huge piece of this new way of thinking is the minimum viable product. You've probably heard it called the MVP. Now, this is not your shiny, finished masterpiece. Nope. It's the most basic, bare-bones version of your product you can build just to get the learning process started. Its whole reason for being is to get it in front of actual customers to test your ideas without wasting a ton of time and money. The goal here is learning, not launching. And this really all comes down to one fundamental truth. And Steve Blank himself said it perfectly. Business plans rarely survive first contact with customers. It doesn't matter how brilliant your plan looks on paper, reality always gets a vote. So the goal isn't to have a perfect plan, it's to have a process for adapting to what's real as fast as you possibly can. Okay, so you've got the mindset, you've got a modern blueprint. But you still need fuel to get the engine going. Which brings us to our next section, the fuel, finding the funds. And look, we have to talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, venture capital. The media just loves the story of the brilliant founder and their visionary VC, right? But research from Diane Mulcahy suggests maybe we should pump the brakes on that narrative. Let's just run through some of these myths real quick. Is VC the primary source of startup funding? Nope, not even close. Do VCs take big personal risks? It's mostly their investors' money. Do they always have amazing advice? That's a huge maybe. And those spectacular returns you hear about? On average, the industry actually underperforms. The whole VC model itself hasn't really changed in decades. And if you want proof that you don't need VC money to build an absolute empire, just look at Chobani. Hamdi Ulukaya started by buying a closed-down factory with a loan from the Small Business Administration. That's it. No VCs, no outside investors. By just obsessing over his product and growing smart, he built a billion-dollar brand. And he stayed the sole owner. It just goes to show you there are other ways to get to massive scale. But here's the thing. Whether you're funded by a VC or you're bootstrapping it like Chobani, success brings its own enormous challenge. And that leads us to the gauntlet, scaling to survive. This is the stage where so many amazing, promising companies just die. And the stakes here are just incredibly high. I mean, look at this number. Research from Harvard Business School found that a staggering 75% of all startups ultimately fail. And it's not because the idea was bad. It's usually because they just couldn't handle the chaotic, treacherous process of growth. So how do you manage that kind of hypergrowth? Well, LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman gives us a framework for this chaos, and he calls it blitzscaling. Now, this isn't your normal, efficient, steady growth. No way. This is a wartime strategy. It's about putting speed above everything else, even efficiency, so you can become the first mover at scale and just dominate a market. Blitzscaling isn't just one thing. It's about getting through these different stages of growth. You start as a small family, then you become a tribe, then a village, a city, and maybe even a nation. And here's the critical part. At every single stage, the rules completely change. How you talk to each other, how you hire, how you manage, it all has to evolve. I guarantee you, the playbook that works for a 10-person family will absolutely destroy a 100-person village. And Reid Hoffman's metaphor for what this feels like is just perfect. It's not like you're following a map. He says it's like you throw yourself off a cliff and assemble your airplane on the way down. It's chaotic, it's terrifying, and you have to constantly be improvising. That is the reality of scaling at lightning speed. And all of this brings us to our final act, the real climax of the whole entrepreneurial story. We call it the end game, rich or king. This is where the founder has to make their most personal and often the most gut-wrenching decision of all. Harvard Business School professor Noah Wasserman, he studied thousands of startups, and he found this core conflict, this tension, right at the heart of the founder's journey. He gives it a name, the founder's dilemma. And the dilemma boils down to a pretty fundamental trade-off. Do you want to be rich or do you want to be king? Now, the rich path, that's all about building the biggest, most valuable company you can. To do that, you give up more equity to get the best investors and the best talent, but that almost always means you eventually give up control. The king path is about prioritizing that control. You hold on to your equity, you stay in charge, but this usually means you end up building a smaller company. You can't have it both ways. And Wasserman found this wild paradox at the center of this choice. Success makes founders less qualified to lead. Let that sink in for a second. The very skills that make a founder incredible at starting something, that vision, that passion, that hands-on control, those are often not the skills you need to manage a big, complex organization. So in a strange way, your own success is what creates the need for you to be replaced. Which brings us to the last question, the one that every single founder eventually has to answer for themselves. If it were you, after all of that struggle, all the sacrifice, and all the building, would you rather be rich or would you rather be king? There's no right answer here, only the one that lines up with what success really means to you. What would you choose?